3 centuries passed, and the galaxy moved on. Empires rose and fell. Trade routes shifted. Species that had once been powerful faded into irrelevance, and new ones climbed to take their places. But 2 things remained constant through all those years of change. The Velnori never forgot, and the humans kept growing. Humanity had spread across 47 worlds by the year 2547. They called their government the Terran Commonwealth, and it was run the way humans like to run things, with endless arguments, loud debates, close votes, and the stubborn belief that every voice deserved to be heard, even when most of those voices were wrong. They were not the biggest power in the galaxy. They were not the strongest. Most species considered them a minor civilization, noisy and energetic, but ultimately unimportant. The Velnori, meanwhile, had built a quiet and comfortable life for themselves. Their collective governed 19 worlds, all peaceful, all prosperous. They were known as healers, artists, and scholars. Their ships carried medicine and music across the trade lanes, and they were welcomed almost everywhere they went. Every Velnori child grew up hearing the story of Horizon Watch, of Captain Daniel Cook and his crew who had shared their food and fixed a broken engine and asked for nothing in return. It was taught in their schools. It was sung in their temples. The debt was sacred. But the galaxy was not a kind place, and peace was never permanent. The Drath Dominion had been expanding for over 1,000 years. They were reptilian, massive creatures with thick-scaled hides and cold yellow eyes that showed no warmth and no mercy. Their empire covered more than 900 star systems, and every single one of those systems had been taken by force. The Drath did not trade. They did not negotiate. They looked at the galaxy and saw only 2 kinds of species, those who served them and those who had not yet been conquered. When the Drath turned their attention toward Velnori space, everyone saw it coming. The Velnori certainly did. Their diplomats sent urgent messages to every major power in the galaxy. They went to the Galactic Forum, the grand assembly where representatives from hundreds of species gathered to discuss matters of peace and security. They begged for help. The forum debated for 8 weeks, 8 weeks of speeches and proposals and counter-proposals and amendments to amendments. 8 weeks while Drath warships massed on the border of Velnori space in numbers that made the sky itself look dark. At the end of those 8 weeks, the forum issued a formal statement expressing deep concern about the situation and urging all parties to seek a peaceful resolution. That was all. Deep concern. Nothing more. The Velnori ambassador to the forum, a young diplomat named Oranthe, stood at the podium after the vote and looked out at the hundreds of representatives who had just decided that her people were not worth saving. She was the great-granddaughter of Celestia, and she had the same luminous eyes and the same quiet strength. But where Celestia had wept with gratitude, Oranthe burned with something closer to cold fury. She did not waste words on the forum. She simply turned and walked out. The Caliph Hegemony, the most powerful military force outside the Drath, announced its neutrality the next day. The Caliph were ancient and proud, insectoid beings with crystalline exoskeletons, and a civilization that stretched back 50,000 years. They had the ships and the soldiers to challenge the Drath. Their empress issued a statement saying that the hegemony's duty was to protect its own people, not to fight other species' wars. The Shen Trading Guild, a vast network of merchants who controlled most of the galaxy's commerce, did something even worse. They raised their shipping rates for any cargo going to or from Velnori space, making it nearly impossible for the Velnori to buy weapons or supplies. Profit came first. It always did with the Shen. One by one, every door closed, every ally turned away. Every promise of friendship turned out to be worth nothing at all. The Drath invasion began on a calm morning on the Velnori border world of Tessara. There was no warning. There was no declaration of war. Drath warships simply appeared in orbit, and then the bombardment started. The sky turned orange, then red, then black with smoke and ash. Buildings that had stood for centuries collapsed in seconds. Families that had been eating breakfast together were buried under rubble before they could even reach the door. 12 Velnori worlds fell in the first month. 12 worlds, each one home to millions of peaceful beings who had never raised a weapon against anyone. The Drath did not just conquer them, they broke them. They rounded up survivors and put them in labor camps. They stripped the planets of resources. They burned libraries and temples and hospitals, not because they needed to, but because they wanted the Velnori to understand that everything they had built meant nothing. The Drath commander was a warlord named Kazreth, a massive reptilian who stood nearly 9 feet tall and wore the bones of conquered enemies woven into his armor. He was not just cruel, he was theatrical about it. He broadcast the destruction of Velnori cities on open channels so that every species in the galaxy could watch. It was a message, and the message was simple. This is what we do, and none of you will stop us. He was right. None of them did. The Velnori capital world, Velnor Prime, was the last to fall under siege. Drath ships filled its orbit like a wall of iron and fire. The planetary shield held for a while, but everyone knew it would not hold forever. On the surface, millions of Velnori huddled in shelters and bunkers, listening to the sound of orbital bombardment shake the ground above them, waiting for the end. Oranthe was in a bunker beneath the capital city when she recorded her final message. She sat in front of a simple communication terminal, her 4 hands folded in her lap, her face calm despite the dust falling from the ceiling with every impact. She did not address the Galactic Forum. She did not address the Caliph or the Shen or any of the great powers who had abandoned her people. She addressed the humans. To the people of the Terran Commonwealth, she said. Her voice was steady and clear. 300 years ago, your ancestors helped mine when no one else would. A captain named Daniel Cook opened his doors to strangers and shared everything he had. My great-grandmother Celestia swore a debt that our people have carried in our hearts ever since. She paused as a particularly heavy impact shook the bunker. Dust rained down. Somewhere behind her, a child began to cry. Oranthe did not flinch. I do not ask you to fight for us. I know what we face, and I would not ask anyone to stand against it. I only ask that you remember us. Remember that we existed. Remember that we were kind. Remember that we tried to live peacefully in a galaxy that would not let us. She reached forward and touched the screen with one slender hand. Remember us, as we have always remembered you. The message traveled across the galaxy at the speed of a hyperspace relay, bouncing from station to station until it reached the Terran Commonwealth 9 days later. It arrived during a routine session of the Commonwealth Parliament on Earth. A communications officer flagged it as priority and sent it directly to the Parliament floor. The Speaker of the Parliament, a gray-haired woman named Donna Bailey, played it for every representative in the chamber. The room went silent. 1,200 elected officials from 47 worlds sat and listened to a dying woman ask them to remember her people. When the message ended, there was a long moment of quiet. Then Donna Bailey stood up, looked around the chamber, and said 6 words. What are we going to do? The vote was the fastest in Commonwealth history. It was not even close. Every single representative from every single world voted the same way. They were going to war, not because it was smart, not because it was safe, not because there was anything to gain. They were going to war because 300 years ago, a man named Daniel Cook had said that decent folks help because it is right, and humanity had never stopped believing that. Within 6 hours, every military vessel in the Terran Commonwealth had received new orders. Within 12 hours, supply lines were being reorganized, reserve units were being activated, and shipyards on a dozen worlds were pulling crews back from leave. Admiral Nate Prescott was aboard the carrier Steadfast when the orders came through. He was 51 years old, broad-shouldered, and had a face that looked like it had been carved out of rough stone by someone who did not believe in smooth edges. He had served in the Terran Navy for 30 years and had fought in 3 border conflicts, but nothing in his career had prepared him for what he was reading. He called his executive officer, Commander Lisa Barrow, to the bridge. Lisa was 10 years younger than Nate, sharp-eyed, and known throughout the fleet for her ability to stay calm when everything around her was falling apart. She read the orders twice, and then looked at Nate. "The draft have 1,600 ships at Velnor Prime alone," she said. "We have 93 in the 5th Fleet. The rest of the Navy is weeks away." Nate nodded. "I know. This is going to be the most lopsided battle in human history. I know that too." Lisa studied his face. "You are not even slightly worried, are you?" Nate thought about it for a moment. Then he shook his head. "No, I am not worried. I am angry. There are people out there who helped us when we were nothing, and now they are dying because nobody else in this galaxy has the spine to do what is right. That makes me angry, Lisa. And you do not want to fight humans when they are angry." Lisa almost smiled. "You really do not." Nate turned to his navigation officer. "Plot a course through the Blackthorn Corridor. Best possible speed." The navigation officer hesitated. "Sir, the Blackthorn Corridor runs through a binary star system. The gravitational interference makes it extremely dangerous. Most species consider it unnavigable." "Most species are not us," Nate said. "We mapped that corridor 3 years ago for exactly this kind of situation. Plot the course." The Steadfast and its 92 escort vessels turned toward the Blackthorn Corridor and began to accelerate. Behind them, across 47 worlds, the rest of humanity was waking up and getting ready. The Velnori had asked them to remember. Humanity was about to show the galaxy what it looked like when humans remembered. The Blackthorn Corridor was everything the navigation chart said it was, and worse. 2 massive stars circled each other in a slow and violent dance, their gravity fields twisting space into knots that would tear an ordinary ship apart. Radiation storms swept through the corridor in unpredictable waves. Sensor equipment flickered and died. Navigation computers screamed warnings that the crew had to manually override every few minutes. Nate Prescott stood on the bridge of the Steadfast and watched the chaos through the forward viewport, his hands clasped behind his back, his jaw set. Around him, his bridge crew worked in focused silence, their fingers moving fast across their consoles, making corrections and adjustments that kept the fleet alive 1 second at a time. Lieutenant Jake Brennan, the navigation officer, had not slept in 31 hours. His eyes were red, and his hands were shaking slightly, but his voice was steady every time he called out a course correction. Beside him, Ensign Maria Cortez fed him data from the sensor array, reading numbers aloud in a calm tone that made it sound like she was reading a grocery list instead of guiding 93 warships through a gravitational death trap. They lost 2 ships in the corridor. The frigate Harlan County hit a gravity shear that no one saw coming and broke apart in less than 3 seconds. The destroyer Kate Mercy took a radiation burst that fried its main computer, and the ship drifted into the gravitational pull of the smaller star before anyone could reach it. 67 crew on the Harlan County, 112 on the Kate Mercy, 179 people who had been alive and breathing and telling jokes in the mess hall just hours before. Nate said their names. He stood on the bridge and read them from the crew manifest, while the fleet kept moving forward, because stopping was not an option, and forgetting was not something humans did. The Blackthorn Corridor cut 19 days of travel down to 4. When the Fifth Fleet burst out of the corridor and into Velnori space, they came in fast and hard, their ships battered and scorched, but every weapon system online and every crew member at battle stations. What they saw made even Nate pause. Velnor Prime hung in space like a bruised jewel, its atmosphere hazy with smoke from the fires burning on its surface. And between the fleet and the planet stood the Drath Armada. 1,600 warships, arranged in a formation that blotted out the stars behind them. Battleships, the size of small cities. Carriers that bristled with fighter craft. Destroyers and cruisers and gunships. All of them bearing the red and black markings of the Drath Dominion. All of them radiating a kind of brutal, overwhelming power that was designed to make any enemy lose hope before the first shot was even fired. 91 human ships against 1,600 Drath warships. The numbers were insane. Any sane military commander would have taken one look at those odds and ordered an immediate retreat. Nate opened a channel. "This is Admiral Nate Prescott of the Terran Commonwealth," he said. His voice was broadcast on every frequency, reaching not just the Drath fleet, but every listening post and relay station in the sector. Within hours, the entire galaxy would hear what he said next. "The Velnori are under our protection. You will withdraw your forces from Velnori space immediately. You will release all Velnori prisoners. You will provide reparations for the worlds you have burned. This is not a negotiation. You have 1 standard hour to begin your withdrawal. After that, we will remove you ourselves." On the bridge of the Drath flagship, Warlord Kazreth listened to the message and laughed. It was a deep, rumbling sound that made the officers around him flinch. He was enormous even by Drath standards, his yellow eyes burning with amusement, his scaled hide scarred from 100 battles. He had conquered 37 species in his career. He had never lost. He broadcast his response on the same open channel. "Little humans," he said, his voice thick with contempt. "You are small, and you are few, and you are very far from home. I will enjoy adding your worlds to my collection. Your bones will make fine decorations." He cut the channel and turned to his officers. "Destroy them. Save a few alive. I want them to watch when we finish burning their precious Velnori." The Drath fleet began to move, 1,600 ships surging forward, in a wave of steel and fire that should have been the end of everything. It was not. The Battle of Velnor Prime began at 1400 hours, Galactic Standard Time, and for the first 30 minutes, every military analyst watching from across the galaxy assumed they were witnessing the quick and total destruction of the human fleet. They were wrong. Nate did not try to match the Drath head-on. He was outnumbered, and he knew it, and he was not stupid enough to play a game he could not win. Instead, he did something that the Drath had never encountered in 1,000 years of conquest. He broke every rule of conventional space warfare and made up new ones on the spot. The human fleet split into 7 independent strike groups, each one operating under its own commander, but coordinated through a communication system that the Drath could not jam because human engineers had built it to work on frequencies that no other species used. The strike groups dove into the Drath formation like wolves into a herd, getting so close to the enemy ships that the Drath's heavy weapons could not fire without hitting their own vessels. The Drath were used to fighting species that formed neat lines and traded volleys at long range. They had no idea what to do when small, fast, heavily armored human ships started appearing between their own capital ships, firing at point-blank range and then darting away before the return fire could track them. Commander Lisa Barrow led Strike Group 3, 12 frigates that she personally guided into the heart of the Drath formation. Her target was Kazreth's flagship, a massive vessel called the Iron Throne that sat at the center of the Armada like a spider in its web. Lisa knew that if they could kill the flagship, the Drath command structure would collapse. The Drath were not built for independent thinking. They followed orders from the top, and when the top was gone, they fell apart. She lost the first frigate, the Norfolk, 4 minutes into the run. A draft destroyer caught it with a broadside that tore through its hull like paper. She lost the second, the Avalon, 2 minutes later, when it took a direct hit from a draft battleship's main cannon. She lost a third, a fourth, a fifth. Her squadron shrank around her as she pushed deeper into the formation, and every ship she lost meant people she had trained with, eaten with, laughed with, gone forever in a flash of light and metal. She did not stop, because, somewhere below them, on the surface of Velnor Prime, millions of Velnori were counting on them, and Lisa Barrow was not the kind of person who let people down. 9 of her 12 frigates were gone by the time she reached firing range of the Iron Throne. The 3 survivors, battered and leaking atmosphere, lined up their torpedo tubes and fired everything they had. The Iron Throne's shields held against the first volley. They flickered against the second. The third punched through and hit the reactor core. The explosion was visible from the surface of Velnor Prime. Kazrith and his entire command staff died in a ball of white fire that lit up the sky like a second sun. And just as Lisa had predicted, the draft fleet began to fall apart. Without Kazrith's orders, individual captains hesitated, contradicted each other, and made mistakes that the human strike groups exploited without mercy. The battle raged for 11 hours. 11 hours of close-range fighting, of ships burning and breaking, of human crews pushing their vessels far beyond what any engineer would have called safe. When a human ship was too damaged to fight, its crew did not surrender. They aimed what was left of their vessel at the nearest draft capital ship and accelerated. The draft had never seen anything like it. They had conquered species that begged, species that fled, species that fought bravely and then accepted defeat. They had never fought a species that simply refused to lose, that treated every setback as a reason to fight harder, that turned even their own destruction into a weapon. By the 11th hour, the draft fleet was broken. Over 1,100 of their ships were destroyed or disabled. The survivors were scattering in every direction, fleeing from a force that was less than a tenth of their original size, but fought with a fury that defied all logic and reason. Every surviving vessel was damaged. The Steadfast had a hole in its port side that you could fly a shuttle through. Nate Prescott had a piece of shrapnel embedded in his left shoulder that he had been ignoring for the last 6 hours. Lisa Barrow brought her 3 surviving frigates back to the fleet and docked with the Steadfast. She walked onto the bridge, still wearing her combat suit, her face pale with exhaustion, her hands still steady. Nate looked at her, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. Then Nate nodded. "Well done, Commander." Lisa sat down heavily in the nearest chair. "How many did we lose?" 31 ships, just over 3,000 people. Lisa closed her eyes. 3,000. 3,000 humans who had followed her and Nate into an impossible battle against an enemy that outnumbered them 16 to 1. 3,000 people who would never go home. Was it worth it? She whispered. Below them, the smoke was beginning to clear over Velnor Prime. On the surface, Velnori were emerging from their shelters, looking up at a sky that was no longer filled with Drath warships. He could not see them from orbit, but he knew they were there. Millions of them. Alive. Safe. Because 31 human ships and 3,000 human lives had stood between them and annihilation. Yes, he said quietly. It was worth it. On the surface of Velnor Prime, in a bunker beneath the capital city, Oranthe watched the battle's end on a flickering screen. She watched the Drath scatter. She watched the human ships, battered and broken and still flying, take up protective positions in orbit above her world. And she wept. Pale silver tears, the same tears her great-grandmother Celestia had wept 300 years ago aboard a tiny human space station, rolled down her face and fell onto her folded hands. She had asked them to remember. They had done so much more than remember. The news spread across the galaxy like fire through dry grass. Every species, every government, every intelligence agency and military command that had been watching the situation in Velnori space received the same impossible report within hours of the battle's end. A human fleet of 91 ships had engaged a Drath armada of 1,600 vessels and won. The Drath warlord Kazreth was dead. His fleet was scattered. Velnor Prime was free. The first reaction, almost universally, was disbelief. The Caliph Hegemony's military intelligence division ran the numbers 4 times because they were certain someone had made an error. The Shen Trading Guild's analysts assumed the report was human propaganda. Even the Galactic Forum's own observers, who had recorded the battle from a safe distance, submitted their findings with a note saying they could not fully explain what they had witnessed. But the evidence was undeniable. The Drath, the most feared military power in the known galaxy, had been beaten by a species that most galactic governments had dismissed as irrelevant, and the humans were not done. Within 2 weeks of the Battle of Velnor Prime, 3 more Terran fleets arrived in Velnori space. The second fleet under Admiral Grace Holden came through the standard shipping lanes, escorting a convoy of supply ships loaded with food, medicine, and building materials for the Velnori. The third fleet under Admiral Kevin Marsh took up defensive positions along the border between Velnori and Drath space. The seventh fleet under Admiral Patricia Dunn began preparing for offensive operations. The Terran Commonwealth issued a formal declaration that was broadcast across every diplomatic channel in the galaxy. Ambassador Diane Sutton, the Commonwealth's representative to the Galactic Forum, delivered it personally. She was a small woman, barely 5'4", with gray-streaked brown hair and eyes that could make a senator twice her size look away. She had been a diplomat for 23 years, and she had never once raised her voice. She did not need to. When Diane Sutton spoke, people listened. The Terran Commonwealth recognizes the Velnori Collective as a protected ally, she said, standing at the forum podium that Orenthay had walked away from just weeks before. We will liberate every Velnori world currently under Drath occupation. We will free every Velnori prisoner held in Drath labor camps. And we will ensure that the Drath Dominion is never again in a position to threaten the Velnori or any other peaceful species. She paused and looked around the chamber. 400 species stared back at her. We asked you for help, she said, and her voice was quiet, but carried to every corner of that enormous room. We asked you to stand with the Velnori when they needed you. You chose not to. That is your right. But understand this. We did not come here to ask permission. We came here to tell you what is going to happen. And if any government in this chamber has a problem with that, they are welcome to take it up with our fleet. Nobody took it up with their fleet. The liberation of Velnori space took 3 months. 3 months of sustained military operations across 12 occupied worlds, each one a battle in itself, each one costing human lives. The Drath had dug in deep on the worlds they had conquered, building fortifications and using Velnori civilians as shields. It was ugly, brutal work, and it required the kind of patience and precision that most species did not believe humans possessed. They were wrong about that too. On every liberated world, human marines went in first. They cleared the Drath garrisons building by building, block by block, taking enormous care to avoid civilian casualties. It would have been faster to simply bombard the Drath positions from orbit, and several of the allied species observing the campaign suggested exactly that. The humans refused. There were Velnori civilians down there, and the humans would not kill the people they had come to save just to make the war easier. Lieutenant Hannah Cole became the face of the liberation campaign, though she never wanted to be. She was 26. From a farming colony on a world called New Bridgewater, and she had joined the Marines because she wanted to help people and could not afford medical school. She was average height, average build, with freckles and short red hair that she kept tucked under her helmet. There was nothing remarkable about her appearance. What was remarkable was what she did. On the 7th liberated world, a city called Tesserine, Hannah's platoon was clearing a residential district when they came under heavy Drath fire. The Drath had set up a machine gun position in a collapsed building, and they were cutting off a group of Velnori civilians who had been hiding in a basement shelter. The civilians could not move without being shot, and the Drath were not interested in taking prisoners. Hannah led a squad around the back of the Drath position, took it out with grenades and close-quarters fighting, and then moved to evacuate the civilians. Most of them were able to walk, but one, a Velnori child no bigger than a human toddler, was badly injured and could not move. The child's light patterns were flickering weakly, and she was making a soft, keening sound that Hannah did not need a translator to understand. She cradled the child against her chest with one arm, slung her rifle across her back with the other, and started running. The route back to the evacuation point was 6 blocks long and completely exposed. Drath snipers were active in the area. Hannah's squad tried to provide covering fire, but there was only so much they could do. She ran those 6 blocks with plasma bolts hitting the ground around her feet, with pieces of buildings exploding above her head, with a wounded alien child pressed against her armor. She did not stop. She did not slow down. She did not even consider putting the child down and fighting back, because the child was more important than the fight. A journalist embedded with a Caliph observer team had captured the entire thing on camera, and within days, the footage had been seen by billions of beings across the galaxy. When the journalist tracked Hannah down afterward and asked her why she had risked her life for an alien child, Hannah looked at him with a confused expression and said, "She was hurt and she was scared. What else was I supposed to do?" That sentence was translated into over 300 languages. It appeared on news broadcasts across the galaxy. It was quoted in speeches at the Galactic Forum. It became, in many ways, the single sentence that defined humanity to the rest of the galaxy. Not their military power, not their technology, not their stubbornness or their courage, or their impossible victory at Velnor Prime. Just a young woman holding a child and asking, with complete sincerity, why anyone would do anything different. The Drath attempted to negotiate 3 times during the Liberation campaign. Each time, the Commonwealth repeated the same terms: full withdrawal, release of prisoners, reparations. The Drath refused each time. They could not believe that a species so small could sustain this level of effort. But humanity's civilian population had mobilized in a way that the galaxy had never seen. Factories on human colony worlds shifted to wartime production within days. Workers volunteered for double shifts. Civilian cargo captains offered their ships for supply runs to the front lines, knowing that Drath raiders might find them along the way. Citizens who had never met a Velnori donated money, food, clothing, and medical supplies to refugee relief efforts. A retired schoolteacher named Ruth Casey on the colony world of Haven organized a donation drive that collected enough medical supplies to fill 3 cargo ships. When a reporter asked her why she cared about aliens she had never met, she said something that could have come straight from Daniel Cook's mouth 300 years earlier. Because someone was in trouble and needed help. That is reason enough. The Caliph hegemony watched all of this with growing unease. Their empress, a towering crystalline figure named Zel Vasti, summoned her chief military advisor and demanded an explanation. How had a species with 47 worlds defeated an empire of 900? How had they mobilized their entire civilization in weeks? How had they produced soldiers who would carry enemy children through gunfire, and civilians who would donate their savings to help strangers? Her advisor, a veteran general named Cole Thren, studied the data for a long time before answering. They are not fighting for territory, he said. They are not fighting for resources or power or glory. They are fighting because they believe it is right. And a species that fights for what it believes is right does not calculate acceptable losses. They simply refuse to lose. Zelvasti was silent for a long moment. Then she asked the question that was keeping every leader in the galaxy awake at night. What happens when they finish with the Drath and turn their attention to the rest of us? Kolthren did not have an answer. At the Galactic Forum, a Kalith diplomat approached Diane Sutton and asked her a similar question, though more diplomatically. He asked why humanity was spending so much blood and treasure for a species most humans had never interacted with. He wanted to understand the logic. There had to be a strategic calculation, a long-term plan, some rational explanation for this extraordinary expenditure of life and resources. Diane looked at him for a moment, and then she said something that was immediately broadcast across the galaxy and would be quoted for centuries to come. Because someone helped us once when we were small and frightened and alone. And we promised ourselves we would never forget what that meant. The diplomat stared at her. He was trying to find the deeper meaning, the hidden strategy behind her words. He could not find it because there was none. She meant exactly what she said. That terrified him more than any fleet ever could. The Drath Dominion surrendered 6 months after the Battle of Velnor Prime, and the galaxy held its breath. It was not just the military defeats that had broken them, though those defeats were devastating. In 3 months of sustained combat, the Terran Commonwealth had destroyed or captured over 3,000 Drath warships, liberated all 12 occupied Velnori worlds, and freed more than 400,000 Velnori prisoners from labor camps. The Drath Navy, once the most feared fighting force in the galaxy, had been reduced to a shadow of itself. But it was not the battles that truly ended the war. It was the realization, creeping through the Drath High Command like a slow poison, that the humans would never stop. This was not a species that fought until the cost became too high and then negotiated. This was not a species that could be worn down through attrition or intimidated through displays of force. Every time the Drath reinforced a position, the humans found a way through it. Every time the Drath drew a line, the humans crossed it. Every time the Drath expected them to hesitate, they accelerated instead. The Drath's supreme commander, an old reptilian named Varek, who had replaced Kazreth after the Battle of Velnor Prime, called a meeting of his surviving generals in the war room of the Dominion's capital world. He asked them a simple question. Could they win? The room was silent for a long time. Then his most senior general, a scarred veteran named Falketh, spoke the truth that no one else was willing to say. We cannot win, Falketh said. Not because they are stronger than us, not because they have better ships or better weapons. We cannot win because they do not think the way we do. We fight to conquer. They fight to protect. And a species that fights to protect something it loves will endure things that a species fighting for conquest will not. They will absorb losses that would break us. They will keep coming when any rational species would retreat. They are not rational about this. They are something worse. They are certain. Varek stared at him. Certain of what? Varek asked. That they are right, Falketh said, and nothing in the galaxy is more dangerous than that. The surrender was formal and public, broadcast across every channel in the galaxy, so that every species could witness it. The Drath withdrew from all Velnori territory. They released every prisoner. They agreed to pay reparations that would take a generation to fulfill. And at the personal insistence of Admiral Nate Prescott, the Drath High Command was required to issue a formal apology to the Velnori people. The ceremony took place on Velnor Prime, in the central plaza of the capital city. The plaza had been damaged during the siege, and the Velnori had not yet had time to repair it. Scorch marks darkened the walls of the surrounding buildings. But the Velnori had cleaned the space as best they could, and thousands of them filled the plaza and the surrounding streets to watch. Varek stood at the podium. He was massive, nearly as large as Kazreth had been. But where Kazreth had been theatrical and cruel, Varek was quiet and tired. He read the apology in a flat voice. He did not mean a word of it, and everyone knew it. But the words were spoken and recorded, and that was what mattered. The Drath would remember this humiliation. It would burn in their memory for generations. And that was the point. Nate Prescott stood to one side of the podium, his left arm still in a sling. He had finally allowed the medics to remove the shrapnel from his shoulder 2 weeks earlier. But the joint had not fully healed, and it ached constantly in a way that he suspected would never entirely go away. He did not mind. It was a reminder. Oranthe stood beside him. She had aged visibly in the 6 months since the war began. The light patterns beneath her skin, which had once pulsed with bright, warm colors, now moved in slower and more subdued rhythms. She had lost friends, family, and entire communities in the Drath invasion. She would carry that grief for the rest of her life. But she was alive. Her people were alive. Their worlds were free. And that was because of the tall, stubborn, impossibly brave humans standing around her in their battered uniforms and scarred armor. When the ceremony ended and the Drath delegation departed, Oranthe turned to Nate. The crowd was still watching, and cameras from 100 species were still recording, but she did not care. "How do I repay this?" she asked. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "How do the Velnori repay what your people have done?" He thought about Daniel Cook, a man he had never met who had lived 300 years before him, standing in a tiny space station and giving water to a dying alien because it was the decent thing to do. He thought about the 3,000 humans who had died at Velnor Prime, and the thousands more who had died in the Liberation Campaign. He thought about Hannah Cole carrying a child through gunfire, and Ruth Casey filling cargo ships with medicine, and Lisa Barrow flying 12 frigates into the heart of an enemy fleet, because that was what needed to be done. He smiled. It was a tired smile, but it was real. "You do not owe us anything, Oranthe," he said. "Decent folks help because it is right. That has not changed in 300 years, and it is not going to change now." Oranthe looked at him with those luminous Velnori eyes. "Your ancestor said the same thing to mine. Some things are worth repeating." The galaxy changed after the Drath War. Not all at once, and not in every way, but in ways that mattered. The Galactic Forum passed 16 new resolutions in the year following the surrender. Resolutions on mutual defense, on humanitarian intervention, on the obligation of member species to respond when peaceful civilizations were threatened. For the first time in the Forum's history, these resolutions had real enforcement mechanisms. They had teeth, and everyone understood, though no one said it aloud, exactly why. The Caliph Hegemony signed a mutual defense pact with the Terran Commonwealth, the first such agreement the Caliph had entered into in over 2,000 years. Empress Selvasti traveled to Earth personally to sign the treaty, and when she stood before the Commonwealth Parliament, she said something that shocked her own people. "We watched the Velnori suffer and did nothing," she said. "The humans watched and acted. We are the older species, but they are the wiser one. The Caliph will not make this mistake again." The Shen Trading Guild established a permanent humanitarian relief fund and reduced its shipping rates for any cargo classified as emergency aid. It was widely understood that this was less an act of generosity and more an act of self-preservation. The Shen were merchants. They understood value, and the most valuable thing in the galaxy, they had learned, was being on the right side of the humans. Other changes were subtler, but no less significant. Across the galaxy, species that had bullied their neighbors began to reconsider. Empires that had been expanding aggressively pulled back to their borders. Trade disputes that had been escalating toward conflict were suddenly resolved through negotiation. The galaxy did not become peaceful overnight, but it became more careful, because everyone now understood something fundamental about the small, stubborn, sentimental species from the Orion Arm. Humans remembered kindness, and they repaid it with a loyalty that could break empires. But they also remembered cruelty, and every species that had ever wronged another, every government that had built its power on the suffering of weaker peoples, every leader who had ever looked away while innocents died, now lay awake at night wondering the same terrible question. Did the humans know? And if they did, would they come? Ambassador Diane Sutton delivered the closing address at the first post-war session of the Galactic Forum. She stood at the podium in the great circular chamber, a small human woman surrounded by representatives of 400 species, some of them ancient beyond human comprehension, some of them powerful beyond human measure. She looked out at all of them, and she did not look small at all. "I know what you are feeling," she said. "I know that many of you are afraid, not of our ships or our weapons or our soldiers. You are afraid because you have seen what humans will do for the people they care about, and you are wondering what that means for you." She paused. The chamber was utterly silent. "I cannot tell you not to be afraid. Fear can be useful. It can make you think before you act. It can make you consider the consequences of cruelty. But I can tell you something better than that. I can tell you that you do not have to be afraid at all. Because the same thing that makes us terrifying in war is the thing that makes us the best friends you will ever have in peace. We remember. That is who we are. We remember the people who hurt us. Yes, but far more importantly, we remember the people who were kind." She straightened up and looked around the chamber one final time. "Be kind," she said. "You never know who remembers." She stepped down from the podium. The silence lasted for a long time. And then, slowly, one by one, the representatives of 400 species began to applaud. It started with the Velnori delegation, who rose to their feet, their light patterns blazing with emotion. Then the Caliph, then the smaller species, the ones who had been afraid of the Drath for centuries, and were still trying to understand a galaxy where someone had actually done something about it. Then even the Shen, who never applauded anything they could not profit from, stood and joined in. The sound filled the chamber and spilled out into the corridors and broadcast feeds beyond. It was heard on thousands of worlds, by billions of beings, and it carried a message that was older than any species in that room. That kindness matters. That decency endures. That the smallest act of compassion, offered freely and without expectation, can echo across centuries and change the fate of civilizations. 300 years ago, a human captain had given water to a dying stranger, and said that decent folks help because it is right. 300 years later, his descendants had crossed the galaxy to prove it. And the galaxy would never be the same. 300 years before the galaxy learned to fear humanity. A broken alien ship drifted into Earth's orbit and changed everything. The year was 2047. Humanity had only just figured out how to travel between the planets in its own solar system. They had a handful of space stations, a few mining outposts on Mars, and a stubborn belief that the universe was worth exploring, even if it scared them half to death. They were small, they were young, and they had absolutely no idea what was floating toward them. The ship was enormous compared to anything humans had ever built. It was shaped like a curved leaf, pale silver, and covered in symbols that no human language could read. It tumbled slowly through the void, dark and silent, No lights, no engine glow, nothing to suggest that anything inside was still alive. But the distress signal it broadcast was impossible to ignore. It pulsed through every frequency, a slow and repeating cry for help that needed no translation. Captain Daniel Cook was the commanding officer of Horizon Watch, a small orbital station that had been built to monitor deep space debris and track asteroid paths. He was 44 years old, had a thick brown beard that he refused to trim, and was known among his crew as the kind of man who made decisions fast and worried about the paperwork later. When the alien signal hit his screens, he did not hesitate for even a second. "Open the docking clamps," he said. "Bring them in." His second-in-command, a young officer named Beth Harding, looked at him like he had lost his mind. "Sir, we have no idea what that is. Protocol says we should report to Earth Command and wait for instructions." Daniel looked at the readings on his screen. The ship's power was almost gone. Internal temperatures were dropping fast. Whatever was inside that vessel was going to freeze to death long before Earth Command finished writing a memo about it. "Beth," he said quietly, "there is something alive in that ship, and it is dying. We can sit here and follow protocol, or we can act like decent human beings. I know which one I am picking." Beth did not argue again. She gave the order, and the docking clamps opened wide. It took 2 hours to cut through the outer hull and open a path into the alien vessel. Daniel led the boarding team himself, wearing a basic environmental suit and carrying nothing but a flashlight and a medical kit. What he found inside stopped him in his tracks. They were tall, nearly 7 feet, with bodies that seemed too thin and too graceful to be real. Their skin was pale and slightly translucent, and beneath it, faint patterns of light pulsed weakly, like dying embers. They had 4 arms, each one long and delicate, and their faces were smooth with large dark eyes that reflected the beam of Daniel's flashlight like pools of black water. There were 63 of them, men, women, and children, or at least what Daniel assumed were children based on their size. They were huddled together in the largest compartment of the ship, wrapped in thin blankets that did almost nothing against the cold. Many of them were unconscious. Some of them were clearly sick. All of them were starving. They were the Velnori, a peaceful species from a star system far away, traders and scholars, who had been traveling through the region when their ship's main drive had failed. They had sent distress signals for 6 months, 6 months of drifting through empty space, watching their food run out and their power fade, calling for help on every channel they knew. Not a single one had answered. Until the humans. Daniel did not understand their language. They did not understand his. But some things do not need words. He knelt beside the nearest Velnori, an older female whose light patterns had almost gone completely dark, and he pressed a water canister into her 4 trembling hands. She looked at him with those enormous dark eyes, and even though neither of them could speak a word the other would understand, something passed between them that was older than language. Help, gratitude, trust. Daniel turned to his crew. "Get every blanket on this station, every ration pack, every medical supply we can spare. Move." For 3 weeks the 42 men and women of Horizon Watch gave everything they had. They shared their food, even though it meant cutting their own meals in half. They gave up their bunks so the Velnori could sleep somewhere warm. Sam Fletcher, the station's only physician, worked around the clock to figure out alien biology using nothing but a basic scanner and sheer determination. He lost 4 patients in the first week and cried after each one, then wiped his eyes and went back to work. The Velnori recovered slowly. As they regained their strength, they began to communicate through gestures and simple drawings. The humans learned that the Velnori elder, the female Daniel had first given water to, was named Celestia. She was a navigator, a person of high rank in their society, and she watched everything the humans did, with quiet and intense attention. Meanwhile, a team of human engineers led by a stubborn mechanic named Carl Porter spent every waking hour trying to fix the Velnori drive core. The technology was centuries beyond anything humans had ever seen. He pulled the damaged components apart, studied them until his eyes burned, and then rebuilt them using human parts that had absolutely no business fitting into an alien engine. He welded, rewired, and improvised with a creativity that bordered on madness. On the 19th day, the drive core hummed back to life. Carl stood in front of it, covered in grease and alien coolant, and grinned like a child on his birthday. When the time came for the Velnori to leave, Celestia stood before Daniel in the station's small docking bay. Her light patterns were bright again, pulsing in slow, warm waves that the humans had come to understand meant deep emotion. Pale silver tears ran down her smooth face as she pressed all four of her hands against Daniel's two. Through a crude translation device that both species had worked together to build during those 3 weeks, she spoke words that would be recorded in the Velnori memory archive and passed down for generations. You did not know us. You owed us nothing. You gave us everything you had. The Velnori will carry this debt until the stars go dark. One day, we will find a way to repay you. Daniel squeezed her hands and smiled. You do not owe us anything, Celestia. Decent folks help because it is right, not because they expect something back. You just go home safe. That is all the payment I need. Celestia looked at him for a long moment. Then she said something that the translation device could only partly capture, but the meaning was clear enough. You are a strange species. I think the galaxy does not yet understand what you are. The Velnori ship pulled away from Horizon Watch, its drive core glowing with new life, and disappeared into the stars. Daniel watched it go from the observation window, his arms crossed, his expression thoughtful. Beth stood beside him. Think we will ever see them again? She asked. Daniel shrugged. Maybe, maybe not. Does not change anything. He went back to work and life on Horizon Watch returned to normal. The crew ate smaller meals for a while until the next supply run came. Nobody complained. 300 years later, the galaxy would learn just how right Celestia had been. Humanity was indeed a strange species, and the galaxy did not understand what they were. But it would. Soon enough, it would.